Emily worked the cleaning cloth into the polished wood of the nightstand, the faint aroma of bleach hanging in the air as she moved with practiced precision. She wiped her brow, her fingers trembling slightly from the day's exhaustion. This was her routine, one she had followed for over 2 years in this opulent hotel. She cleaned spaces that radiated a kind of grandeur she could barely fathom, filled with luxury so rich it clung to every surface. To the guests she served, she didn't exist. They swept past her like she was part of the decor, no more noticeable than the glimmer of the marble floors or the crystalline glow of the lobby chandeliers. This day had started like any other. Emily entered the suite of James Carter, a billionaire she only knew from the whispered rumors and fleeting glimpses of hotel staff gossip. Her task was simple: dust, vacuum, and vanish before anyone noticed her presence. James was not the type to linger. His comings and goings were always surrounded by a whirlwind of assistants and associates. But today the air felt different. As she reached the nightstand, muffled voices drifted from the adjoining room. Her hand froze mid-swipe, the cloth stilling on the polished surface. She wasn't one to eavesdrop. Years of working in a space of invisible labor had taught her to tune out the personal lives of the wealthy. But this conversation? It was sharp, hushed, and it drew her in. The female voice was familiar, and recognition dawned as Emily listened closer. Amanda Carter, James' wife. Emily had only ever seen Amanda from a distance, her presence as striking as her wealth. But the words she heard chilled Emily to the bone. "He'll never see it coming," Amanda whispered, her tone laced with venom. "We'll make sure this trip is his last." Another voice answered, lower and colder, a man Emily didn't recognize. "It has to be clean, Amanda. If anyone suspects us, we're finished." Emily's heart hammered in her chest. Her breath hitched as she gripped the cloth tighter. It wasn't unusual to hear disputes or even scandalous conversations behind closed doors, but this wasn't just a lover's spat. This was a plot, a deadly, calculated plot. "You know how important this is, Ryan," Amanda said again, her voice losing its sweetness and dropping into something almost icy. "One mistake, and it's over." Emily's mind reeled. Ryan? The name didn't belong to James. Amanda was speaking with a lover, a secret partner. But the details of the conversation left no room for interpretation. Amanda and this Ryan planned to kill James Carter. Panic surged through Emily. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to pretend she hadn't heard a thing. Yet her feet stayed rooted in place, and her mind raced with questions. Should she warn someone? Should she go to the police? Who would believe her? A maid, someone so far removed from the world of privilege she'd stumbled upon. Even if they did believe her, wouldn't Amanda and Ryan just come for her next? Emily pressed a trembling hand to her forehead as the weight of what she'd overheard bore down on her. There was no guarantee James was a good man. People of his wealth rarely were, but could she let someone die when she had the chance to stop it? Her decision didn't come lightly. Yet by the time she left the suite, her mind was made up. The evening passed in a blur of anxiety as Emily replayed the conversation she'd overheard. Sitting in the employee lounge, the chipped mug of lukewarm coffee before her remained untouched. Her mind swirled with unanswered questions and fear. What if Amanda and Ryan realized someone had been in the room? What if they suspected her? The thought made her shudder. Emily didn't have the kind of life where she could afford risks like this, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. She had to find a way to warn James, discreetly, without exposing herself. The next morning, Emily's opportunity came. She spotted James in the bustling hotel lobby, his commanding presence impossible to miss amidst the hum of bellhops and guests. He moved with his usual entourage, a figure of importance and precision, but to Emily, he now seemed more vulnerable than he could possibly know. Her heart pounded as she approached him, rehearsing her words over and over. She only had one shot at this. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice shaky but firm enough to carry over the noise. He turned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took her in. His gaze flickered to her name tag, his expression unreadable. Emily wasn't used to being noticed, especially by someone like him, and her nerves nearly got the better of her. But she pressed on. "I need to tell you something about your trip," she said quickly, her voice lowering as she stepped closer. You shouldn't go. Something's not right? James raised an eyebrow, skepticism radiating off him. He didn't say anything immediately, studying her as though she were a puzzle he didn't have the time to solve. And why? He asked finally, his tone laced with measured incredulity. Should I trust you? Emily's breath caught, and she hesitated. She couldn't explain everything, not without risking herself. But I can't say much, she stammered, her voice thick with urgency. Just trust me on this. Please, don't go. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in James' expression. Curiosity? She couldn't tell. He straightened, smoothing the front of his impeccable suit. I'll think about it, he said, his voice clipped and dismissive, before turning to leave. Emily stood there, frozen as the crowd swallowed him up. That was it. She'd done all she could. Whether he believed her or not was out of her hands now. She'd tried to warn him, but the weight of what might happen if he didn't heed her words sat heavy on her chest. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. Emily went through the motions of cleaning, her body on autopilot while her mind spiraled. She couldn't shake the dread building inside her. What if James didn't take her seriously? What if Amanda and Ryan went through with their plan? And worse, what if they somehow traced it all back to her? By the time she left work that evening, the usual cacophony of the city felt distant. The honking taxis, the chatter of tourists, and the hum of life all blurred into background noise. Emily hurried to her small apartment, her nerves stretched thin. As she turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, the quiet of her home only amplified the tension thrumming in her veins. She tried to distract herself, but sleep evaded her that night, her mind consumed with what she'd overheard and the gamble she'd just taken. The next morning, something felt off before Emily even stepped outside. Her hand lingered on the door handle as a sense of unease settled over her. When she finally opened it, she froze. Parked outside, gleaming under the morning sun, was a sleek, black luxury car. It stood out starkly against the worn brick and cracked sidewalks of her modest neighborhood. Her stomach twisted. Before she could retreat back inside, the car door opened. A man in a sharp black suit stepped out, his movements precise and deliberate. He adjusted his hat and locked eyes with her, his face calm but unreadable. Miss Emily? He asked, his voice measured and polite. Emily nodded, her throat tightening as she gripped the doorframe for support. Yes? The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a crisp white envelope. This is for you, he said, offering it to her. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling as she took the envelope. Who sent this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man's faint smile didn't waver. Mr. Carter, he replied simply. He wanted to ensure you received it. Relief mixed with confusion washed over her. She watched as the man tipped his hat, returned to the car, and drove away. Back inside her apartment, Emily sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the envelope as though it might explode. Her name was written on the front in elegant script. Carefully, she slid her finger under the seal and pulled out the contents. Inside was a single note, written in the same refined hand. Thank you for your concern. I've decided to cancel the trip. Enclosed is something I believe you'll find useful. Alongside the note was a small key, plain and unassuming, attached to a silver keychain engraved with the words Wilshire Towers. Emily's brow furrowed as she turned the key over in her hand. Wilshire Towers was an upscale apartment complex downtown, far beyond anything she could afford. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away. The message was from an unknown number. Your new place is ready. Welcome to a fresh start. They seek asterisk. Her breath hitched. A fresh start? Was this real? Why would James Carter do something like this for her, a maid he barely knew? She expected gratitude, maybe a simple thank you. But an apartment? A new life? It didn't make sense. As questions swirled in her mind, a single thought took hold. Her life was no longer her own. Whatever this was, it was only the beginning. The key to Wilshire Towers felt heavy in Emily's pocket as she made her way downtown later that day. The towering building loomed ahead, its sleek glass facade shimmering in the afternoon sunlight. She paused on the sidewalk, staring up at it, her chest tightening with unease. This place wasn't just a step up from her cramped apartment, it was a world apart. Everything about it screamed wealth, exclusivity, and power, things that had always seemed so far out of her reach. Her heart pounded as she stepped through the polished glass doors. A doorman greeted her with a polite nod, as though people like her walked into buildings like this every day. "Good afternoon, miss," he said, his tone warm but professional. "How may I help you?" Emily swallowed hard, fumbling for the words. "I this key," she said, pulling it out and holding it up as though it might explain everything. The doorman's eyes flicked to the keychain and then back to her. He smiled, tapping something into the building's security system. "You're all set. Elevator to your right. 15th floor." Emily nodded, mumbling her thanks as she crossed the marble-floored lobby to the waiting elevator. Her reflection in the mirrored doors caught her off guard. Her nervous expression and plain clothes stood in stark contrast to the elegance of her surroundings. She felt completely out of place. The elevator ride seemed to stretch on forever, her nerves climbing with every passing floor. When the doors finally slid open, she stepped out into a quiet, carpeted hallway. Apartment 1504 was just a few steps away. She stood in front of the door, key in hand, willing herself to turn it. Her breath hitched as she finally unlocked the door and pushed it open. The apartment took her breath away. Hardwood floors gleamed under the recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the New York City skyline. The furniture was modern and elegant, every detail perfectly curated, from the soft gray of the couches to the sleek stainless steel kitchen appliances. She wandered through the space in a daze, running her fingers over the smooth countertops and plush fabrics. It was more than just beautiful, it was a dream made real. Yet, as she stood in the middle of the expansive living room, the weight of it all pressed down on her. None of this made sense. Why would James Carter give her this? Why would he care enough about her, a maid, to offer such a lavish gift? Gratitude for her warning couldn't possibly explain this level of generosity. Her thoughts spiraled as she sank onto the couch, burying her head in her hands. Gratitude didn't come without strings. There had to be something more to this, something she wasn't seeing yet. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood, crossing the room to peer through the peephole. Relief washed over her when she saw it wasn't Amanda or anyone threatening. It was a young man dressed in a sharp black suit, clipboard in hand. "Miss Emily?" he asked when she opened the door. "Yes," she said cautiously, gripping the edge of the door. The man extended a hand with a practiced smile. "Good evening. My name is Evan. I'm Mr. Carter's assistant. He sent me to ensure you're settling in comfortably and to give you a brief tour of the building." Emily blinked, taken aback. "A tour?" Evan nodded. "Yes, of course. Mr. Carter is very particular about ensuring his guests have access to all the amenities. If you'll follow me?" The word guest stuck in Emily's mind like a thorn. That's all she was to James, a temporary visitor in this world of privilege and power. It didn't feel real, but she followed Evan anyway, her confusion mounting with every step. He showed her the building's private gym, a sparkling rooftop pool, and a luxurious lounge area that looked like something out of a magazine. By the time they returned to her apartment, Emily felt like she'd stepped into a parallel universe. Evan handed her a small card with his contact information before bidding her goodnight. As soon as he left, the silence of the apartment became overwhelming. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the twinkling city lights, her thoughts swirling. This place was beautiful, but it wasn't hers. It felt like a gilded cage, trapping her in a world she didn't belong to. The next morning, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from a restless sleep. Groggy, she reached for it, squinting at the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Her pulse quickened as she hesitated, then finally answered. "Hello." The voice on the other end was brisk and professional. "Miss Emily, this is Detective Martinez with the NYPD. I need to ask you a few questions regarding Mr. James Carter." Emily's stomach dropped. Her grip tightened on the phone. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice barely steady. There was a pause on the other end, then Martinez replied, "There have been some developments. I understand you've recently been in contact with Mr. Carter." We'd like to speak with you in person. Can you come down to the station today? Her mind reeled as fear took hold. Is Mr. Carter, is he all right? She asked, dread lacing her voice. Another pause. Then the detective's voice softened slightly, though it gave no comfort. I'll explain everything when you get here, Miss Emily. It's urgent. The line went dead, leaving Emily staring at the phone in disbelief. Her thoughts spiraled. What had happened to James? Did Amanda and Ryan know she'd warned him? The implications were terrifying, and the unknown loomed like a storm cloud over her head. As she got dressed and left the apartment, her legs felt like lead. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her nerves frayed as she made her way to the police station. Whatever was waiting for her there, it was clear her life was far from returning to normal. The police station buzzed with an energy that put Emily on edge the moment she stepped inside. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow, and the faint smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. It wasn't a place she'd ever imagined herself, let alone as someone potentially tied to a case involving billionaires and attempted murder. Emily approached the front desk, her voice barely steady as she spoke. I'm here to see Detective Martinez. The officer behind the desk gave her a once-over before gesturing toward a set of double doors. Second office on the right, he said, barely looking up from his paperwork. Her heart pounded as she followed his directions, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. The weight of everything she'd learned, everything she'd done, bore down on her like never before. When she finally reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering just inches from knocking. What if this was a trap? What if Amanda had somehow orchestrated all of this? But she couldn't run, not now. Taking a deep breath, she knocked lightly, the sound barely louder than her racing heartbeat. The door opened to reveal a man in his late 40s, his expression serious but not unkind. His plain suit and slightly disheveled desk made him look more approachable than she'd expected. Miss Emily? He asked, stepping aside to let her in. She nodded, stepping into the cramped office. Papers and folders were stacked high on every surface, giving the impression of a man overwhelmed by the sheer volume of his work. He motioned for her to sit, and she sank into the chair opposite his desk, clutching her purse tightly in her lap. Thank you for coming in, Martinez said as he sat down, flipping open a folder on his desk. I won't waste your time. Mr. Carter recently canceled a trip, and I understand you played a part in that decision. Emily's stomach tightened. But I overheard something, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought he might be in danger. Martinez leaned forward, his gaze sharp. What exactly did you hear? Taking a deep breath, Emily recounted the conversation she'd overheard between Amanda and Ryan. Every word she spoke seemed to bring the memory back to life, the venom in Amanda's voice, the cold calculation of Ryan's responses. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling, and she could barely meet Martinez's gaze. The detective was quiet for a moment, scribbling notes in his pad. Finally, he sat back, his expression unreadable. You did the right thing by warning him, he said slowly. Canceling that trip likely saved his life. But there's more to this story than you realize. Emily frowned, her nerves prickling. What do you mean? Martinez hesitated before answering, as though carefully choosing his words. Mr. Carter has been investigating his wife for some time now. Financial fraud, infidelity, and now, it seems, attempted murder. He's been working with us to gather evidence, but your warning pushed everything into motion. What you overheard confirmed his suspicions. The weight of the revelation settled on Emily like a stone. James had known. He'd known there was something dangerous lurking beneath Amanda's polished exterior, and her warning had only confirmed it. Is he safe now? She asked, her voice barely steady. For now, his tone measured. He's under protective custody while we gather more evidence. But we need to tread carefully. Amanda Carter is not the kind of woman to go down quietly, and her lover Ryan is just as dangerous. If they suspect you were involved, he didn't finish the thought, but Emily understood the implication. The room felt colder, smaller. She'd been trying to help, to do the right thing, but now she realized just how dangerous the situation had become. Amanda and Ryan had already planned one murder. What was stopping them from adding her to their list? What should I do? Emily asked, her voice trembling. Stay alert, Martinez said firmly. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, call me immediately. We can't afford to take chances. Emily nodded, rising to her feet on shaky legs. As she left the station, the detective's parting words echoed in her mind. You did the right thing, but had she? Her entire life had been thrown into chaos, and she wasn't sure if it was worth the price she might end up paying. The city streets felt different as she walked back to her apartment. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every sound sharper. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that Amanda or Ryan, or both, already knew she'd intervened. By the time she reached her building, her nerves were raw, and her chest felt tight with the weight of everything she'd learned. But the worst was yet to come. Her phone buzzed as she stepped inside, and she froze. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made her blood run cold. With trembling hands, she answered. Hello. A long pause, followed by the faint sound of breathing on the other end. Then, a voice she recognized too well. Emily, Amanda's voice purred, smooth and chilling. We need to talk. Emily's stomach turned to ice. Her grip on the phone tightened, her knuckles going white. How had Amanda gotten her number? What did she want? You think you're clever, don't you? Amanda continued, her tone darkening. But you've made a big mistake. People like you don't mess with people like me and get away with it. I'll make sure of that. The line went dead, but Amanda's words lingered like a dark cloud over Emily's head. She stood there, frozen, as the weight of the threat settled into her chest. Amanda knew. She knew, and she wasn't going to let Emily off the hook. Emily's hands shook as she set the phone down on the counter. Amanda's voice still echoed in her ears, her cold threat like a dagger lodged in her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, to regain control, but her thoughts were spiraling. Amanda knew. And if Amanda had been ruthless enough to plan her husband's murder, there was no telling what she'd do to someone she saw as a threat. The apartment, which had felt so alien and luxurious just days ago, now felt like a trap. Every shadow in the corners seemed to move, every creak of the walls amplified. Emily paced the room, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to call Detective Martinez, to tell him about Amanda's call, but what could he do? The police couldn't watch her every moment, and Amanda wouldn't hesitate to make good on her threat. A sharp knock at the door jolted her out of her spiraling thoughts. Her body froze, fear rooting her to the spot. Was it Amanda? Had she already sent someone to silence her? After a moment of hesitation, Emily crept toward the door, her breath shallow. She pressed her eye to the peephole, and relief flooded her when she saw the familiar figure of James Carter standing there. He looked different from his usual composed and polished self. His suit was slightly rumpled, and the strain on his face was clear. Without thinking, Emily unlocked the door and pulled it open. James, she said, her voice a mix of relief and confusion. What are you doing here? James stepped inside quickly, glancing down the hallway before shutting the door behind him. I needed to talk to you, he said, his voice low and urgent. There's more to this than you realize. Emily's heart sank. She thought she'd uncovered the full extent of the danger surrounding Amanda and Ryan, but James' tone told her otherwise. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What else is there? James ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small living room as though he couldn't contain the weight of what he was about to say. After you warned me about Amanda and Ryan, I started digging deeper, he began. I knew Amanda was hiding something, but I didn't realize how far back it went. Emily, this isn't just about me. It's about your father. Her stomach dropped, the air leaving her lungs as if she'd been punched. My father, she repeated, her voice trembling. What does he have to do with any of this? James stopped pacing and turned to face her. His eyes softened, filled with something Emily couldn't quite place. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. Your father and we knew each other, he admitted. We grew up together. He was like a brother to me. Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair. Her father had never mentioned James, not once. Her father, who had died when she was just a girl, leaving her and her mother to scrape by alone. The idea that he had been connected to someone like James Carter felt surreal. I don't understand, Emily said, her voice shaking. Why didn't he ever tell me about you? James sighed, sitting down across from her. Because by the time you were born, things had already gone wrong. Your father got involved in something dangerous, something connected to Amanda's family. And when he tried to get out, they made sure he couldn't. Emily's chest tightened as James' words sank in. Are you saying my father's death wasn't an accident? James nodded grimly. It wasn't. Amanda's family orchestrated it. He was going to blow the whistle on them, expose their crimes. But before he could, they framed him and made it look like a tragic accident. Emily's mind reeled. Her father's death had always been a painful but distant memory, something she had forced herself to accept as an unchangeable part of her past. But now, the truth shattered everything she thought she knew. Her father hadn't been just another victim of a random tragedy, he had been silenced. I can't believe this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me sooner? James' gaze dropped to the floor. Because I didn't know the full story until recently. And even then, I didn't want to drag you into something so dangerous unless I had no other choice. But now that Amanda knows you're involved, he paused, meeting her eyes. You needed to know the truth. Emily's hands clenched into fists. The grief and anger she had buried for so long now roared to the surface, hot and raw. She killed my father, she said, her voice shaking. And now she's trying to kill you. We can't let her get away with this. We won't, James said firmly. But we have to be careful. Amanda is dangerous, and she has resources. This isn't just about revenge, Emily. We need to find solid evidence to bring her down, for your father's death, for the fraud, for everything. Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't the same invisible maid she had been just days ago. Amanda had taken everything from her father, her childhood, her sense of safety, and Emily wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. What do we do next? She asked. James' expression darkened, a mix of determination and concern. We gather proof, he said. But we need to act fast. If Amanda knows you're a threat, she won't stop until she takes you out of the picture. For the first time in years, Emily felt a fire ignite inside her. Amanda thought she could silence her, but Emily had already survived more than Amanda could imagine. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. I'm not afraid of her, Emily said, her voice steady. If she's responsible for my father's death, I need to know. And I need to make sure she pays for it. James nodded, his respect for her clear. Then we do this together. But we have to be smart. Amanda doesn't play games, and she's not going to go down without a fight. Emily stood, her fists clenched at her sides. Amanda Carter had underestimated her, but she wouldn't make that mistake again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations and plans. Emily couldn't stop replaying James' words in her mind. Your father's death wasn't an accident, the weight of the truth pressed down on her like a stone, but it also fueled her resolve. Amanda Carter wasn't just a murderer, she had stolen Emily's father, her childhood, and her sense of safety. It was time to take everything back. James stayed in close contact, updating Emily as he worked with Detective Martinez to build a case. The files they already had were damning, but they needed more, something that would irrefutably tie Amanda to her crimes. The problem was that Amanda's family had built their empire on lies and manipulation, and undoing that kind of power wasn't going to be easy. Emily felt the tension mounting with each passing day. She barely left her apartment, her nerves stretched thin as she watched the windows and doors for any sign of Amanda or Ryan. Every phone call, every shadow seemed like a potential threat. But the fear was tempered by a growing determination. Amanda wasn't going to intimidate her into silence, not again. One evening her phone rang, and her heart leapt into her throat when she saw James' name on the screen. She answered quickly, her voice tight with anxiety. James? We need to meet, he said, his tone urgent. I've found something big. Emily's pulse quickened. What is it? Not over the phone, James replied. Can you meet me at Delancey's downtown in an hour? It's quiet out of the way. Emily agreed, her mind racing. She threw on her coat and left her apartment, her nerves jangling as she made her way through the bustling streets. When she reached the small, dimly lit cafe, James was already there, seated in a corner booth. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but his expression was resolute. "What did you find?" Emily asked as she slid into the seat across from him. James leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've been digging through Amanda's family records, and it's worse than I thought. Your father wasn't just a victim, he was a threat. He was going to expose the entire Carter empire. Amanda's family has been running scams, fraud, and illegal business deals for decades, and your father knew everything." Emily's stomach churned. "And that's why they killed him?" James nodded grimly. "They framed him first. Made it look like he was stealing from their company to discredit him. But when that wasn't enough to keep him quiet, they took the next step. Amanda's father orchestrated the whole thing, and she's been carrying on his legacy ever since." Emily clenched her fists, the anger and grief bubbling to the surface. "And now she's doing the same thing to you?" "Yes," James said. "And to anyone else who gets in her way. But we have a chance to stop her, Emily. We just need the final piece of the puzzle." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. James leaned back, his gaze sharp. "Amanda has a safe house, an estate upstate that she uses to store sensitive materials. Ryan told me about it. If we can get to those files, we'll have everything we need to bury her for good." Emily's heart raced at the idea. It sounded dangerous, impossibly dangerous, but it also felt like their only shot. "How do we get in?" she asked. James hesitated. "It won't be easy. The estate is secluded, and Amanda keeps it locked down. But according to Ryan, it's not heavily guarded. Amanda doesn't think anyone knows about it. If we're careful, we can get in and get out without her ever knowing." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we have to do it. If those files can prove what she did to my father, we can't let them stay hidden." James studied her for a moment, concern flickering in his eyes. "You don't have to come, Emily. This is dangerous. If something goes wrong—" Emily cut him off. "I'm not sitting on the sidelines, James. This is my fight too. I need to be there." He didn't argue, though his jaw tightened with worry. "All right, but we have to be smart about this. Amanda won't forgive mistakes." The drive to the estate the following night was tense, the silence between them thick with anticipation. Emily stared out the window, the dark woods blurring past as they left the city behind. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily on her chest, but she refused to let fear hold her back. When they finally reached the estate, it loomed ahead like something out of a Gothic novel. The massive mansion sat shrouded in shadows, its tall iron gates slightly ajar. Overgrown vines clung to the stone walls, and the windows were dark and lifeless. It looked abandoned, but Emily knew better. James parked the car a safe distance from the gates, cutting the engine. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "Let's do this." They moved quickly, keeping low as they approached the gates. The night was eerily quiet, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting Emily's nerves on edge. The air felt heavy, as though the estate itself was holding its breath. Once inside the gates, they made their way to the back of the mansion. Ryan's instructions had been clear. The safe was in a small study on the second floor, hidden behind a false panel in the wall. Getting to it would be the easy part. Getting out was another story. James pushed open a side door, and the old hinges groaned in protest. The interior was just as foreboding as the exterior, dark, cold, and silent. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. It was clear no one had lived there in years, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They navigated the dim hallways carefully, the floorboards creaking under their weight. When they finally reached the study, James wasted no time searching for the hidden panel. Emily stood by the door, her nerves frayed as she listened for any signs of movement. "There," James whispered, his fingers finding the latch. The panel slid open with a quiet click, revealing a small steel safe. Emily's pulse quickened. This was it, the files that could expose Amanda and finally bring her to justice. But just as James began working on the safe, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. "James," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "Someone's coming." The sound of footsteps grew louder, each one sending a jolt of fear through Emily's body. She glanced at James, who was frantically working to open the safe. His fingers moved with precision, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Whoever was coming would be there any second. Almost there, James muttered under his breath, his voice tight with urgency. Emily's heart pounded as she pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting to the shadowy hallway beyond. She could barely breathe, her chest tightening with dread. When the safe finally clicked open, James wasted no time grabbing the files inside and stuffing them into his bag. "We need to go," Emily hissed, her voice trembling. But before they could move, the door creaked open. Emily's stomach dropped as Amanda stepped into the room, her presence commanding and cold. She wore a sharp, tailored coat, her hair pulled back tightly, and her eyes gleamed with calculated malice. "Well, well," Amanda said, her voice smooth and venomous. "If it isn't the maid and her knight in shining armor. I have to admit, I didn't think you'd have the guts to come here." James stepped in front of Emily protectively, his expression hard. "It's over, Amanda. We have the files. Everything." Amanda's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You really think a few pieces of paper will stop me? You've always been so naive, James. That's why you've always been so easy to manipulate." Emily's blood boiled at Amanda's smug tone, but she couldn't let anger cloud her judgment. Amanda wasn't alone. Out of the shadows behind her stepped Ryan, his expression conflicted but resolute. In his hand was a gun, its barrel glinting under the dim light. "Ryan," James said, his voice low and steady. "You don't have to do this. You can still make the right choice." Ryan's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with hesitation. For a moment, Emily thought he might lower the weapon, but Amanda's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Don't listen to him," she snapped, her tone icy. "You know what happens if you betray me, Ryan. You'll lose everything." Emily saw the fear in Ryan's eyes, the weight of Amanda's control bearing down on him. But there was something else there, too, regret, perhaps, or desperation. She took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. "Ryan, you're not her pawn," Emily said, locking eyes with him. "If you go through with this, you'll never be free of her. But if you help us, you can finally walk away." Amanda turned on Emily, her expression venomous. "Stay out of this," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Emily didn't back down. "You're wrong, Amanda. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you don't have a choice. But Ryan does. He doesn't have to be like you." The room was silent for a long moment, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. Ryan's grip on the gun wavered, his hand trembling. Amanda's eyes narrowed, her sharp gaze cutting into him. "Ryan," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Don't you dare." But Ryan took a shaky breath and lowered the gun. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Amanda's eyes flared with fury. "You coward," she spat, lunging toward him. Before she could reach him, James stepped in, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. Amanda let out a furious scream, thrashing in his grip, but James held her firmly. "Get the gun," James barked, and Ryan quickly picked it up, his hands shaking. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she realized they had done it. They had the files and they had Amanda. But the sound of approaching footsteps from down the hallway sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Amanda's men were coming. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said urgently, his voice trembling. James nodded, his grip on Amanda unyielding. "Stay close," he told Emily as they moved toward the door. Emily's heart raced as they hurried down the dim hallway, Amanda's furious voice echoing behind them. "You think this is over?" Amanda sneered, her tone dripping with malice. "You're all dead. You don't even realize it yet." Emily ignored her, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden floors grew louder, and her breath came in shallow gasps as they reached the main door. When they burst outside into the cool night air, the tension didn't ease. A group of Amanda's hired thugs stood at the far end of the driveway, their eyes locking onto Emily, James, and Ryan. Without hesitation, one of them shouted, "There they are," and reached for a weapon. "Run!" James shouted, shoving Amanda into the back seat of the car before diving into the driver's seat himself. Emily barely had time to scramble into the passenger seat before the car roared to life, and James slammed on the gas. Bullets pinged off the metal frame, the sharp cracks echoing through the night as they sped down the long driveway. Emily ducked instinctively, her heart hammering as she clung to her seat. The mansion disappeared behind them, but the danger wasn't over. Amanda sat in the back seat, her wrists bound with a piece of rope James had grabbed, her cold eyes glaring daggers at them. "You haven't won," Amanda hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You don't even know what you've started." James didn't respond, his focus on the road. Emily glanced back at Amanda, a chill running through her. Amanda might have been restrained, but the fight wasn't over, not yet. The car sped down the dark highway, the city lights still a distant glow on the horizon. Inside the vehicle, the tension was suffocating. Amanda sat in the back seat, her wrists bound, her sharp gaze cutting through the dim light. Emily kept glancing at her, uneasy under the weight of her smirk, calm, too calm for someone who had just been caught. "You think you've won, don't you?" Amanda said, breaking the silence. Her voice was sharp and mocking, her lips twisting into a sneer. "You have no idea what you're dealing with?" James tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw clenched. "You're done, Amanda. It's over." Amanda let out a low laugh that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Oh, James. You've always been so self-righteous. You really think a few stolen files will take me down? My family has been untouchable for decades. You're just playing in our world, and you're already losing." Emily's hands curled into fists in her lap. "You're not untouchable," she said, her voice firm. "We have the evidence, Amanda. You're going to pay for everything you've done, to my father, to James, to everyone you've hurt." Amanda's smile faltered slightly at the mention of Emily's father, but her composure quickly returned. "Your father was a fool," she said coldly. "He thought he could stand against us. You'll end up just like him." Emily's breath caught, the weight of Amanda's words settling on her like a lead blanket. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her lap, the screen lighting up with Detective Martinez's number. She answered quickly, her voice shaky but determined. "Detective, we have her," Emily said. "We're on our way back." "Good," Martinez replied, his voice steady. "But don't come to the station. Amanda's family has connections, people on the inside. It's too risky. Take her to the warehouse on 8th Avenue. I'll have a team waiting." Emily exchanged a glance with James, who nodded grimly. "Understood," she said into the phone before hanging up. As they turned off the highway, heading toward the industrial district, Amanda's unsettling calm remained. The warehouse loomed ahead, a dark, hulking structure at the end of a deserted street. James parked the car, and for a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the air thick with tension. "Stay sharp," James said, his voice low. "Something doesn't feel right?" Emily nodded, her nerves jangling as she stepped out of the car. Amanda didn't resist as James helped her out, her smirk still firmly in place. Ryan, who had been silent since their escape, shifted uneasily. His guilt and fear were written all over his face. As they approached the warehouse door, Emily's unease grew. The area was too quiet, too still. She glanced around, her pulse quickening with every step. When James pushed open the heavy metal door, the creak echoed loudly in the cavernous space. Inside, the dim lighting cast long shadows across the floor. The warehouse seemed empty, but Emily's gut told her otherwise. The sound of their footsteps echoed as they moved deeper inside, Amanda's smirk growing with every step. And then, the door slammed shut behind them. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Three men stepped out of the shadows, their guns drawn, their faces cold and expressionless. Amanda let out a low, satisfied laugh. "I told you," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You're not in control here." One of the men stepped forward, aiming his gun at James. "Hand over the files," he ordered, his tone flat and menacing. James tightened his grip on the bag, his jaw clenching. "You're not getting these." The man cocked his weapon, the sound deafening in the stillness. Emily's mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The tension was suffocating, the standoff stretching on for what felt like an eternity. And then, a voice cut through the darkness. "Lower your weapons." Emily turned, her heart leaping as Detective Martinez and a group of officers stepped into view, their guns drawn and aimed at Amanda's men. Relief flooded her, but the danger wasn't over yet. Martinez stepped forward, his gaze locked on Amanda. "It's over," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're done." Amanda's smirk finally faltered as Martinez approached. "You think this changes anything?" she sneered. "You can't touch me. My family owns this city." Martinez snapped the cuffs onto her wrists, his expression unreadable. "Not anymore." The officers moved quickly, disarming Amanda's men and securing the files James had risked everything to retrieve. Emily stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the weight of the moment hit her. It was over. After everything Amanda had done, everything she'd taken, justice was finally within reach. As the officers led Amanda and her men away, Martinez approached Emily, his expression softening. "You did good," he said. "Your father would be proud." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she blinked them away. The relief she felt was overwhelming, but it was tinged with sadness. This victory couldn't bring her father back, but it could ensure Amanda paid for what she had done. James placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. "We did it," he said quietly. Emily nodded, though her mind was still reeling. They had won, but the fight had left scars she wasn't sure would ever fully heal. As the flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the dark street, she felt a small flicker of hope. Her father's name had been cleared, and Amanda would finally face the consequences of her actions. In the days that followed, Amanda's arrest became headline news. Her family's empire crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and Ryan's testimony sealed her fate. Amanda was convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy and murder. Emily watched the trial unfold, feeling a mix of vindication and grief as the past she had carried for so long was finally laid to rest. But life didn't return to normal. Emily knew it never would. She moved out of the luxurious apartment James had given her, choosing instead a modest home where she could rebuild her life on her own terms. She found a new job, reconnected with friends, and began to heal. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, it felt real. One evening, as she stood on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky, she thought of her father. She wondered if he would be proud of the woman she had become, someone who had fought for the truth even when it seemed impossible. In her heart, she liked to think he would be. Emily took a deep breath, letting the cool air wash over her. The fight was over, but a new chapter was just beginning. Whatever came next, she knew she could face it. She had survived the storm, and now, for the first time in years, she felt at peace.